Thank you, everyone, for joining us this evening for Radical Leadership, Challenging Conventional Wisdom in Education. So this masterclass is designed for educational leaders to think about and question the status quo. And we're going to the presenters tonight are going to look at critical examination of traditional practices and hope to encourage leaders to think outside the box and embrace new and innovative approaches. So I think we're committed here tonight to think about how we can redefine educational leadership, push our boundaries, and respond effectively to the challenges of today's educational landscape. Before I do that, I'd just like to take a moment to do an acknowledgement of country. I'd like to acknowledge the lands on which we speak today and recognize that sovereignty was never ceded. I would like to specifically acknowledge that the Wurundjeri and Bunurong people, communities of the Kulin Nation, are the ongoing custodians of the lands in which Monash University now stands. We pay our respects through our research, teaching, and learning to the Wurundjeri and Bunurong elders and their past, present, and future communities. So now I would like to take the opportunity to introduce Professor Jane Wilkinson, who will be our MC for tonight. And over to you, Jane.
Great. Thanks very much, George, and welcome everyone. It's great to have you on board. I know for many of you as educators, it's 7 o'clock at night and a tiring time, but you've taken the time to come and join us, and we're absolutely delighted for that. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the format of tonight. We've got 4 speakers, and each of us is going to take 8 minutes each. It's kind of a TED-style talk that each of us will give on this particular aspect of the topic of radical leadership. And you see that the names of each of the speakers on the slide here. Dr. George Varian, of course, has just spoken, and George is our course leader of the Masters of Ed Leadership here at Monash, and of course Vanessa Fernandez, Dr. Vanessa Fernandez, and Dr. Fiona Longmuir, as well as myself. So we'll have 8 minutes each of talking to address this topic, and then we're going to have opportunity for Q&A for about 15 minutes or so. If you look down the bottom of your screen, you'll see that there's a Q&A function, and we really encourage you to put any questions or observations as the speakers are speaking into that Q&A function. There'll also be the opportunity for you to raise your hands and ask questions at the end. But please, we encourage you to do that because that's really helpful for us. And at the end, we'll finish with just a short wrap-up to bring everything to a close. You might also encourage you that we are standing on the lands of the Wurundjeri and Boonwurrung people, the communities of the Kulin Nation, but you may be standing on other lands, and we'd encourage you to acknowledge that in the potentially in the Q&A function as well. Okay, so I'd like to begin without any further ado and introduce Dr. George Varian. I'll be giving each speaker a 2-minute warning, so they'll speak for 6 minutes. I'll tell them it's 2 minutes, and then they've got 2 minutes left. And welcome, George, and we're looking forward to hearing from you.
Thank you, Jane. So hello, everyone. As mentioned, my name is George Varian, and I'm the course leader for the Master of Educational Leadership here at Monash University. The conversation I'd like to have today is about the ways in which school leaders, and students negotiate disruptions to the everyday life in school. For example, we've seen the impact of the pandemic, with the challenges of reconciliation with Indigenous Australia. We've seen activism related to the climate crisis, and more recently, the impact of wars abroad that connect to our communities locally. We've continued to see youth protests in a highly polarized political environment. However, there's also housing pressures, cost of living pressures, the continued rapid pace of technological change. AI, for instance, which is changing the ways in which our students are interacting with each other and their educational institutions. So to think about how school leaders might respond, I'll draw on a study of how school leaders did respond to the student climate strikes in Australia. So this was in 2019 and 2020. And I think it's important to revisit those events because it shows just how difficult it is for school leaders to respond to disruptions in the schooling program that interject from the wider culture and politics in which we live. The student climate strike certainly showed how schools and school leaders can be overtaken by events both within and outside of schools. My colleague Brad Gobby from Curtin University and we wanted to know how school leaders were responding to students in their schools who were inspired by Greta Thunberg's activism. These students took to the streets in 2019 across the globe, and we researched how school leaders were represented in the media and how their comments and actions became part of a highly polarized debate around climate activism of young people. So in 2022, we published an article titled The Least We Could Do. Now, the least we could do is a phrase from a principal who said to the press that supporting students by not penalizing them for going to the strikes was the least that he and his school could do. Now, of course, there were reports across the country for schools suggesting that if students had the permission from their parents, they could go. It was a question of parent choice, and parents needed to authorize their children to participate in the strikes. As one leader said, it was up to students and their families to decide if the rally was a worthwhile use of students' time. It was also reported that one principal actually drove students to the rally, but refused to acknowledge this was in any way connected to him taking a position on the issue. Yet other students were reportedly told that strikes were not a valid reason to be missing school and they would be penalized. Some told that they would get a 0 if they missed exams, for example. So some leaders took more risk than others. Some handball the responsibility to parents, and others refused to support students at all. So this phrase, the least we could do, led us to think, well, what's the most leaders could do or should do? Even what more can they do? And in the spirit of this evening's talk, how can leaders think more radically about what education is for? So at the time of writing the paper, we wondered if school leaders in doing the least may become, irrelevant to their students' climate futures, or by sitting on the sidelines might be jeopardizing their own moral leadership. But we should remember that school leaders are not free to do as they please, especially in a political climate that was highly charged around the issue of climate activism of school students. Now, notice the blue highlighted quotes are from conservative parliamentarians, and the red highlighted quotes are from Labour politicians. Uh, so, even at the time, the federal finance minister, Matthias Cormann, said, students should not be used as pawns by professional adult activists as part of a cynical political strategy. So, we continue to face this kind of polarized politics on almost every issue that enters the public sphere. Schools do not exist in a vacuum. Pressures, politics, issues that provoke us all cannot be simply stopped at the school gates. They cannot be wished away. So, what can leaders do? Are they able to engage in politically wise and powerful actions inside and outside of schools? Can they, for example, deal wisely with the accusations that might come, for example, indoctrination that did emerge in the public commentary on student activism? How can school leaders avoid the traps of being for or against, or end up in some kind of us them scenario, often being polarized along party lines? What might radical leadership look like rather than leadership that is reactive, simply putting out fires as they emerge? Now, if we were to be honest, we would acknowledge that these types of problems and tensions are wicked in the sense that they're intractable. There are many such disruptions and tensions in the world that will only continue to disrupt education. So, what can we learn from the environmental activism of students? Well, it's led environmental educators to respond to student activism, and they have argued that to achieve our sustainable goals for the future, there's a need to transform mindsets, behaviors, and institutions. And to do so, many have argued that we need to acknowledge the critical role of emotions, the heart. So it's not just about the head, about knowledge, and about the hands, about what we can do, but it's also about the heart. Many scholars in environmental education argue that schools should provide space for learners and educators also to process their emotions regarding climate change, including their eco and climate anxiety. Yet we know that some educators can tend to see negative emotions as irrational or dangerous for learning and the learning process, and also for the well being of students.
2 minutes, George.
Others can see emotions as rational and natural response and positive for the learning experience. So there are many common emotions that we see in the scholarship around young people and climate change, expressing anxiety, frustration, being overwhelmed, feelings of grief, guilt, but also hope. So environmental educators dealing with this complex and provocative issue have argued that leaders and educators need to reflect on their own emotions regarding climate change, because emotional awareness is crucial for facilitating, responding to, and supporting learners. They have argued that it is not sufficient to only explore knowledge aspects, but incorporate emotional dimensions of human responses to climate change. Moreover, education is not about avoiding negative emotions, but realizing that both positive and negative emotions are necessary to ground hope and promote individual and collective actions. So, as one scholar put it, if educators were open to negative emotions, their students would be more readily to engage in constructive hope. So, emotions, the heart that surrounds climate change, can catalyze students to inquire and gain more knowledge, the head, surrounding the issues of climate change and eventually take action, the hands. Maybe it is to plan a sustainability initiative or to even become a climate strike leader themselves. For instructional leaders, this means making space for critical dialogue, knowledge sharing, co construction of knowledge, but also engaging with emotions, validating them so that students are empowered to take individual and collective action. So the radical question is not how leaders might react, but becomes one of how they can actually respond proactively, transformatively. And they can start by thinking, how well does our curriculum and instructional methods center the heads, hands, and the hearts? Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, George. Fantastic, and some really important questions to end on. So now I'd really like, happy to introduce Dr. Fiona Longmuir, and Fiona's a senior lecturer in the Faculty of Education, and along with George, Vanessa, and I, is one of the key lecturers in the Masters of Educational Leadership. So over to you, Fiona. Thank you.
Thanks, Jane, and thanks, George, for that really provocative start. I think I'm building on what George has been talking to us about there. And when I considered the topic for this masterclass, I was trying to think through some of the key work that I've been doing, the key thinking that I've been doing, and it's centred quite often around ideas of crisis. And what's been interesting about this work, whether it's talking about teacher shortage crisis or crises in terms of student disengagement, or some work that I did, which is what I chose to talk to you about tonight, looking at how school leaders managed through the crisis of COVID. But what's common and what I'm hoping to share through this work tonight is this sense of renewal that's possible, revitalisation that's possible when some of the boundaries that are which are disrupted through issues of crisis enable and provoke new ways of thinking. So, as I mentioned, what I am sharing tonight is a project that I did in 2020 and 2021, and in fact also followed up with some of my participants in 2022, along with some other colleagues from other universities, both here in Australia, in Fiji, and in New Zealand, in our study of leadership beyond the COVID crisis. So the original work spoke with 8 school leaders here in Melbourne. And just as a very quick background, for those who may not know, Melbourne went through very long lockdown periods and had a lot of disruption through the COVID crisis. And I used this work and used a lens of sense making to try and see how principals were navigating the time, how they were finding their way through these really challenging times. And I think some of the findings speak to the continuing types of crisis that school leaders work with. So the first theme from that piece of work that I wanted to draw your attention to tonight was around how that time when the usual expectations of leaders in our schools were removed for these people because of the very unique circumstances that they were in, leaders spoke about how one of the first things that they noticed about the change in their work was that they became community leaders, that their work and their position, their role within the school was so central, not just to those close to them in their daily work in normal times, but moving beyond that, they became really important for families, for other members of the community. They were getting calls from people to ask what was happening, what they knew. They were asked to filter information, to repeat it, to make it digestible for their communities. And they were really central to the navigation of crisis for not just those people within the boundaries of their school, but those people on the periphery as well. So they noticed this real shift in terms of their focus. The next theme that came out was just how important communication became for them. Now, of course, communication is always central to the work of any leadership, but in this time, the communication priorities changed somewhat. It became central and really important for them to be clear and to be honest and open. And what was really interesting in this time was the dialogue that came about and the acceptance and the relational type of communication that came through, where it was okay to say, we're figuring it out, or this is what I know now and I'll let you know more when I can. When it was okay to say, we're trying this at the moment, but we want to get your input and we might need to change things. There became a whole heap more forgiveness and vulnerability in the communication. There also was an added dimension of more personal interactions. People were sharing their homes and their worlds through screens. They were in each other's kitchens and lounge rooms and bedrooms. And so many of the participants in this study spoke about that opening up. I had a principal telling me about, she was singing into a hairbrush as part of a communication with her school, something she would never have done in her performance as a principal when she was actually on site. So it really made her much more of a human and made the people that she worked with much more human. And that was really valuable in the work to help everyone be navigating these really unusual times. Okay, the last theme there, thank you. The last theme is care. So really interestingly, every person that I spoke to spoke about this kind of notion of care, and it came up just over and over again. They spoke about the depth of care that they had to engage with, the deep connections that they made. They spoke about being compassionate, about showing concern. They talked about how that was a big part of their daily work, was just those moments of caring, of showing that other people mattered at that time and how they were going was really important. They spent so much of their time worrying about how people were doing. They spent so much of their time reaching out and checking in. And again, this theme contributed to the strengthening of kind of relationships around these common experiences, that should be, so that this care culture really thrived, even though despite the really challenging circumstances that were happening. As I said, work that happens all the time in schools, and we know that it does, but it became just the central work that everyone was doing under the leadership of these school leaders.
2 minutes, Fiona.
No problem. I'll move to the last slide. So I think what I hoped to provoke and share in this presentation was just how those circumstances where we can uncover from the daily busyness of schoolwork, where we can pull aside the curtains of expectation and performance and data and measurement, and help us really see what it is that schools do for us and for our communities. What is the core purpose of schools? When the chips are down, what brings schools together and what is important in the work that they do? They are social spaces. They are community spaces. They are places, and in fact, lots of scholars and other people argue that they are one of the last remaining real social institutions in our communities. And so what is it that's central to that work? And I think at the moment that's such an important focus because of the ongoing kinds of crises and challenge that we're working with, the ways we're talking in political and social spheres about how we fund schools, how we resource schools, how we look after our teachers, how we care care about the work that's happening in schools. And, until we really highlight these core purposes and care and appreciate the connections, the community, and the caring work that is done within schools, we're going to continue, I think, to struggle to meet these challenges. Thanks.
Thank you, Fiona. Fantastic. Great food for thought there. So I'm delighted to introduce our third speaker, Dr. Vanessa Fernandez. And Vanessa is also a senior lecturer in the Faculty of Education at Monash University and a key member of our Ed Leadership team. Thanks very much, Vanessa.
Hi, everyone. I'm Vanessa Fernandez. So I started off by saying that originally I'm from Pakistan, and the pandemic made me want to go back and look at place-based improvement. And I had started conversations with colleagues of mine in Pakistan in an institute for education, known as Notre Dame Institute for Education. I have worked within the Catholic sector. And from that, we built a partnership, and was an industry partnership with the National Catholic Education Commission in Pakistan. And I put out there some of the elite schools, one of which I also attended when I studied back home in Pakistan. We looked at the system and we started looking at some of the reasons why that system was finding itself to be in crisis. If you think of the background of the Catholic education system, it's existed for more than 200 years there. And we looked at the 244 schools that are a part of that system today, and we were thinking about the fact of, there's a number of things that these schools have been through, not just through the pandemic. So this whole project is taking place from 2022 onwards until 2026, and perhaps even longer. But we were also looking at the diversity between the city and the village, and the country schools, and the complexity of deep-seated patriarchy, poverty, politics as a power structure that was making it quite hard to see improvement work getting embedded within that system. Now, what we also wanted to see was, how does the impact of COVID-19, climate change disasters, political unrest, how does that have an impact on schools? Because schools aren't sitting out of society. They're right in the middle of society. And when all these things happen, school people do take the brunt of it. The community, the teachers, the leaders. And so we thought together on how can we develop a strong transformative educational improvement program. A large number of the students at these schools, as the schools were reporting and as the system leaders were reporting, were female students who had dropped out. And that's the common trend in Pakistan. But over the pandemic, this system found that the female students had dropped significantly. And so all the work that the SDG goals had been, that they had been working on had regressed itself. And the system itself was feeling depleted of hope. So we tried to put a recipe together, and I've called it Hope, Trust, and Love. And I've tried to use that as an acrostic to just run us through it. We wanted to find out and get at the start what the context was that we were actually looking at. There's complexity in that system. And so of the 244 schools, we chose 126 schools. And to start off with, we decided, we want to get some baseline data. We don't want to presuppose what the problem is. We've gone through and reviewed the literature, and we tried to find out that. And we got over 2,500 responses after we started collecting that baseline data. We then, as we were looking at the data and the findings that are coming through, we started telling ourselves, let's look at key essential barriers. There's 7 dioceses in the system, and each diocese works as an independent organizational unit. And let's see what is significant trauma and change that is coming across, because if we can have a common language, then we can plan together. And the idea was, let's do it together. So planning was our key strategy of how do we take evidence that we've collected through the baseline data and put it into action. And so we had all the partners working together, and we've been meeting regularly together since 2022. We wanted to engage the field, and so we used an improvement by design approach where the transformative work is being undertaken by the people in the field with us. So they inform us as we work with them and try to make sense of how they can transform the system for themselves. We also, so that was the hope side of things. Now the trust side of things, how do we develop and frame trust? We also started teaching explicitly on how to bring about change. People were sitting there and they knew what the problem was, they knew what opportunities they had taken, they knew what strengths were being developed in all of that complexity. But what we wanted to also do was help them to learn some specific skills on how they could improve themselves. And so we started explicitly leading leadership seminars since 2022. We reached out to the 7 different dioceses and their staff, and we started developing with them a community of practice approach and building up that trust with them so that we have one EduSpeak or one common language that we all understand together. I was very interested in another project that spoke about universal design for learning, and we have started reading up and educating ourselves in the community of practice approach within each diocese to see how that will help us to design the second stage of this project.
2 minutes, Vanessa.
Okay. So our community of practice approach across the 7 dioceses has the diocese staff working together, looking at what their strategic intent and plan is, and being able to tie that into the information and the evidence that's already come about through the baseline data. So they're not guessing. They have the evidence out there in front of them, and now we're getting together and we're working. And I'm helping them as a leadership researcher, I'm helping them to look at what their new shared values and beliefs are. What do they stand for? What do they provide education, or whom do they provide education to? Who are the people that they're working with? And then we work on leveraging this partnership. So we've been reaching out to other universities, other agencies, other organizations to work with us on this project. And that's the love side of this whole mix. We're offering system opportunities to develop the improvement through a dashboard system, and we're introducing that whole idea of if you know what's wrong and if you're keeping an eye on it, then the chances are that you will be able to continuously provide targeted professional development to help that community of practice to grow. Voices that aren't heard are going to be heard in the second part of this project, and that's what we're busy designing now with some educational designers. And lastly, the aim of the lab is establishing policy and practice assemblies. And I think that's really important. And that's why the 3 levels of systemic improvement is being applied out here. At the systems level with the diocese, individually within each diocese, at school level with the principal and with the teachers. So it is a labor of love, and we hope that we get the system into a better space. So we're all doing together. So I'd like to end with a quote from Paulo Freire, and I'm just going to read that out. For apart from inquiry and apart from the praxis, individuals cannot be truly human. Knowledge emerges only through invention and reinvention. To the restless, impatient, continuing, hopeful inquiry, human beings pursue in the world, with the world and with each other. And that's what we're trying to do. We're saying we're all in it together.
Thank you so much, Vanessa. It's a beautiful statement to end on, very fitting. So you'll have noticed a common theme amongst our talks. There's an acknowledgement of the importance of emotions, of feelings, of care, of love, of an activist collectivist approach to understanding leading, of the heart and of relationality. And I want to tease these points out. And as part of doing this, I'd like to go over what is the problem that we're trying to solve here when it comes to proposing this notion of radical educational leadership. And I want to begin by pointing out some of the myths that we battle against as educational leaders in countries such as Australia. And the first myth, which is a very pervasive one, is the notion of the hero leader. It's a mythology that permeates Western thinking. We tend to think of the leader who's in charge of education, be it in a school or be it in an early childhood centre or in a university or adult education, as the sort of head, if you like. Indigenous peoples, I'd like to contrast, don't necessarily have a word such as leader. That's not necessarily in the lexicon of many Indigenous people's languages. And there's a reason for that, because there is a very different way of conceptualising and understanding leadership that is around the collective. Another particular problem with this notion of the hero leader is that it responsibilises individual leaders. And what I mean by that is the principal or the educational leader who's seen as the head of the early childhood setting, whatever it might be, is that they are held responsible in this day and age for all the outcomes of the school, children's academic outcomes, mental health, etc. And part of this responsibilisation leads to the alarming statistics that we're seeing in things like the Australian Catholic University's longitudinal study of principals' safety, health and wellbeing, which is showing that mental health issues for principals have hit an all-time high. But more insidiously, it means that when we hold individuals up as responsible for these outcomes, we don't think about how broader systemic policies and social structures might be actually creating the kinds of problematic conditions that leaders and educators are being asked to solve. And there's an irony there. And so to illustrate that, I want to quote from a survey of school leaders that Fiona Longmuir and myself and other colleagues did, where we looked at the role of schools and school leaders in building social cohesion. And we did a survey happened to be in March 2020 at the beginning of the pandemic. And we asked school leaders, what do you think are the major social issues facing your school today? And one principal said feelings of disengagement, hopelessness, and at times anger against the disenfranchising inertia of society's power structures. Every social issue I can think of for our school stems from the widening gap in income and its associated beliefs of superiority and inferiority. And so I think that's a really nice illustration and a somewhat sad one of how responsibilising and thinking, holding to this myth of the hero leader is really kind of obscuring the broader kind of structural conditions that lead to particular kinds of outcomes for our children. So how might things change if we think about leading as, for example, a relational and more collectivist practice, which is something that our three speakers have gestured towards, and to think, for example, about leadership, radical leadership as fostering shared responsibility for learning and leading, rather than being invested in one role or authority figure. So to point to a couple of other myths, and then I will answer that question. A couple of other myths we have in Western societies, that educational leadership is a thing that we possess, and it's about power over others. But I ask the question, what about leading as a practice, as a collective and relational practice that rather than being about power over, is about power with others? And I've written about this in a book called Educational Leadership Through a Practice Lens. But my argument is that if we need to shift our way of thinking from leadership as something we possess and which we exercise over others to something that's practiced, a relational kind of practice. So I want to give you an example. Currently, I'm leading an Australian Research Council study with Fiona Longmuir and other colleagues, and we're looking at the emotional labour of public school principals. By emotional labour, we refer to how principals spend so much of their time managing their own emotions and that of other people around them, the kids, the parents, the teachers. This is often an invisible part of principals' work, but it's absolutely crucial. And as part of that emotional management, they engage in what the sociologist, feminist researcher Ali Hochschild calls surface and deep acting. Surface acting is when you know but you're doing it. You know, you're smiling at a parent while you're thinking, I wish they'd just leave. But deep acting is when you internalize it. You don't realize that you're acting. And principals do a lot of deep acting, but it can impose a lot of strain. So in our current study, we're asking principals to contribute to an anonymous survey where they talk about a critical incident that they've undergone as a principal and how they've reacted personally and professionally and what they've learned from it. And I'm going to give you an example of a testimony that we got from a principal. This principal had been physically assaulted by a child, and she congratulates herself on agreeing to get into the police car with the student and the parent and accompany them to the station. And the principal says something like, to be physically assaulted, but then have the compassion and mindset to ensure the safety of the student and to travel with them in the police lockup van is taxing. I was able to remain calm and empathetic, although I was being physically assaulted. So what these sort of testimonies reveal is some things that we shouldn't think of as radical to educational leadership, but I'd argue are still not being taken seriously, both in the research, but also in our policies and the way in which our systems are organised. One of the radical points is that leading is a deeply relational practice. Second, that emotions, all kinds of them, are a crucial part of every aspect of leading, including decision-making. The good emotions, the so-called bad emotions, and the ugly. And thirdly, that principals engage in emotional labour as a crucial aspect of their work, but this work is invisible, and when it is acknowledged, it might be devalued, i.e. it's just what good principals do. So what's radical about this? Well, one of the things we've done is we've taken these testimonies, we've de-identified them, and we've shared them on our website, in forums with principals associations and unions, and we've asked for the principals to respond. And what that does is incredibly powerful. First of all, the principals realise that they're not on their own. And we've had principals say things like, I thought this was just me. I was just the only one experiencing it. But now I realise it's all of us. And what that also allows them is to speak truth to power, because when you share how you're feeling in a safe forum, and it has to be safe, then you can open up the possibility for transformation, for things to change. So that it's not just about you as an individual who's feeling these things, but many others. And that's when change can occur. It's about building solidarities with others. And that is powerful and radical. So I want to talk about, finally, how we can think about leadership differently. And first of all, to think about this notion of power with leading as a shared collective practice. And I'm going to finish, because I'm conscious that time is passing and my timer is about to go off, by finishing with a quote from Hawaiian Indigenous leaders, educational leaders. And they talked about power with rather than power over. And I thought they had the most fantastic way of thinking about educational leadership. They talked about 4 principles: the concept of ha, the breath of life that links all persons, past, present, and future. They talked about the notion of place, in which land, sky, and sea are fundamentally pedagogical. They talked about the 3rd principle of the sacredness of relations and mana. And finally, they talked about the concept of individual generosity and collective action. So I ask you all, what might the sacredness of relations, individual generosity, collective action, and ha, the breath of life, look like for a more radical form of leading in your context? Thank you. So at this point, I'm going to pause, and I'm going to give everyone an opportunity here to raise your hand and to make any observations or comments that you would like. And while you're just digesting it all and thinking about that, I'm going to begin by going back to the Q&A. And thank you so much, people, because there was lots of beautiful acknowledgements of country, on the countries of which you're standing, and we really appreciate that. And I also want to ask a very practical question. Someone asked if they can get a copy of this recording, and absolutely, this is being recorded and will be shared with participants. So I've got a question here from Lisa. And while I'm reading the question out and it's being responded to, I'd really encourage others to pop a question or observation into the Q&A, or you can simply raise your hand, and there is the raise the hand function down the bottom of your screen. So Lisa says, hi Fiona, such interesting research. I'm wondering if you also collected data on the leaders' well-being whilst having to well-being whilst they were having to be this kind of community leader during the crisis. Great question, Lisa.
Thanks, Lisa. Yeah, I certainly did hear from leaders about how they were managing, how they were coping, how they were feeling. As I said, I came back to talk to the leaders at several different points, so got different insights into how they were managing their own well-being and mental health quite often through those times. And I think what I'd say about that is that it is kind of twofold. There was a lot of sense, particularly in the earlier interviews, of hanging on, and that was some language that people use, that they were just hanging on, that they were working harder than they ever had before, that they were feeling the burden of the work. And I guess noting, to connect to my other panelists here, thinking about that there was a kind of a sense that they did step up, in that role of kind of the leader, the hero through that work. But also, I think, contradictory, and what helped them through that was that sense of solidarity, was that sense of opportunity, was that sense of connection that helped them come together with their community and feel like we're all in it together. And they did speak about that. That's another type of language that was used. We're all learning together. We're all in this together. So there was also a real sense of removal of the hierarchy, removal of that kind of leader at the top, whilst also they felt that sense of stepping into to really have to take on that role of helping their community through. So it was quite a bit of a tension, I guess, in terms of how they were managing and how they were seeing the work. But yeah, certainly lots of interesting reflections on their own well-being. And as Jane mentioned, we've kept sort of thinking about issues of the well-being of school leaders through the project that we're looking at the moment, looking at the emotional labour of leaders.
Thanks so much, Fiona. Now, we've got a couple of questions in chat, and I note also that we have got someone who's raised their hand. Actually, we've got a number of observations in chat that have just popped in. So I'm going to go to a couple of the first questions and observations in the Q&A function, and then I'm going to the person who has raised their hand. So don't worry, I can see your hand is up and I'm not ignoring you. So the first one is, hi, our state government is emphasising the importance of all schools teaching phonics explicitly from the earliest years. The research shows the gap very early. This seems to be important from a social justice perspective, so all children can read regardless of their background. Do you see this as a way of breaking down power structures? What an interesting question. I'm going to start by answering that because I am a former English teacher and I did a lot of work in primary and secondary schools around English and literacy. I also am old enough to remember being taught phonics explicitly from the earliest years and falling asleep or virtually falling asleep in the grade because I was very already could read when I went to school, and I came from a very poor working class background, and my mother had 3 years of education. So I guess what I'm pointing to is that the explicit teaching of phonics, I think, is a really important technical practice that needs to be taught as part of a broader repertoire of a rich immersion in reading. And so one of my concerns around this sort of thing is that, yes, it is a crucial and it is important for kids to have that kind of solid foundation. And even if you immerse yourself and read to your kids from the beginning, it doesn't guarantee that those kids are necessarily going to have that solid foundation. So yes, it is important, but it needs to be put as part of a broader foundation. Going to the question of the breaking down power structures, I would say that one of the issues that we typically see as this is what's described as a thin form of pedagogy. And these, unfortunately, what typically can happen is that these more thin forms of pedagogy, these particular ways of teaching, and really to the exclusion of a richer immersion in literature, for example, typically are aimed at poorer, disadvantaged schools and children. And So there is definitely a social justice issue in terms of kids having that foundational knowledge, but also being really understanding that it shouldn't be happening in isolation from broad, rich forms of pedagogical practice. And I think this is one of the major issues that I would be talking about, both as a teacher and also as a former educational administrator and leader. I'm just going to go to a second observation and invite someone from the panel to respond. This is from Gillian. I work in the early years and I feel this is a powerful place for radical leadership to become normal practice. We get to work with the youngest learners and work with them to be part of the change in their families, to change old mindset thinking. I'm wondering if anyone in the panel would like to respond to that. Go for it, please.
Thanks, Jane. I don't do research in the early years, but I would have, what we understand, I guess, is that, you can work at any level. And I think that, if you're working with the youngest, I think that's a great opportunity, like any level as well. I think, that to work with young kids to think about these kind of issues. So, I think there are powerful places everywhere for radical leadership. And I think, the younger they are, I guess, the contradiction there is like to think about, what, the balance between, what is education and what might others suggest is indoctrination, right? So we're always kind of treading that kind of dichotomy, whether it's true or just something constructed in the media. So I think that I was always encouraged by what Michael Apple once said at a seminar many years ago, which was that there are always spaces in any educational space, any educational institution to work towards, radically changing education. So.
Gillian, thank you, and thanks, George. Fiona's typing an answer, but I will also jump in and say that I agree with you. I think the early childhood settings are an extraordinarily important place because the children are young, because you've got the opportunities to influence families in a way that it can be more challenging with older children and families. Also because early childhood has such a proud historical tradition of education around, Montessori, around play-based education, around very rich pedagogies. And I think that's absolutely crucial. And one of the concerns I think that's happening for early childhood educators, many that I talk to, is around the schoolification of early childhood, where, the kinds of norms around testing, etc., are kind of being pushed down into early childhood. And I think that's really kind of perverting, to be quite frank, the importance of that sort of the importance of the whole child, which early childhood educators, I think, are beautifully educated in and exemplify. So I'm going to go to Really Lynn. Really, Lynn, you've had your hand up there for quite a while. Do you want to just jump in and make your comment or ask your question, please? Okay, can't hear from you. Yep, go for it. You had your hand up. All right, why don't you have, just see, I don't know, you may be having some problems, so it might be better if you want to pop it into the Q&A and we'll take it from there. I'm going to go to the next question, which is, do you see student learning difficulties as a major contributor to challenging behaviour in schools? This is a major stressor for principals and school leaders. I'd invite Vanessa or Fiona. Do you want to jump in on that one?
I'm happy to. Vanessa, you're on mute. I'm not sure if you did want to speak.
You can go.
Yeah. Okay. This is actually something I've been engaging with and written about just recently, based on some work that we've done with teachers and understanding how they're experiencing their work at the moment. And certainly also we're hearing about it when we talk to school leaders as well. I think this is a really important conversation that we need to keep having, and we're noticing more and more media coming out about these kinds of issues. I think what we need to do is see these kinds of increasing challenges as symptoms of how our schools are faring as social institutions at the moment. And we need to bring them to the fore and have conversations around, the kinds of levels of respect that we're experiencing in schools, the kinds of behaviours, practices, responsibilizations of educators that we're noticing and that we're expecting of our schools at the moment. So I do think that this is an important stressor to be engaging with and discussing. It's a really hard one, but it is a really important one to be recognising and starting to think about. So yeah, thank you for your question.
Great, thank you, Fiona. And I've got a question here, which is, there was one and it's just disappeared. So I think it must be around the way in which they kind of unfold, so they go down to the bottom. There was a question there around the emotional aspects, the emotional management aspects, and what could be done when systems are actually wielding power. And my response to that would be, well, one of the things would be to really kind of rethink the role of the principal, that we cannot be all things to all people. And so I think that's crucial. Another thing I would also say is that we need specialist staff to be on tap all the time, like we have school nurses in some schools, but to deal with the sorts of major issues and ongoing issues that children are facing. And so really trying to sort of think about how we can spread the load so it's not something that's just coming back and being exhibited through, for example, challenging behaviours for the principal to have to deal with it. I think building a culture of acceptance that not just around that it's okay for principals to be vulnerable, but also that it's really important that principals have clear backup and support from specialist staff, and it could be staff, it could be retired principals or whatever, and that's there for them on an ongoing basis. So some sort of kind of, not just for new principals, although that's crucial too. And I'm going to finish. We've got a couple more, we've got quite a few questions, but I'm going to pick up on a question from David Gurr. Given the speakers in your summary, Jane, it seems like using the term leadership is not useful for your views. How else could you describe your view using another way to label this that distinguishes this type of organisational behaviour from other types of work? And so I would respond by saying, if we think about leading as a practice, as social and relational collective action that's not just invested in the authority figures of one person, it's rethinking what we understand by leadership. And if we look to Indigenous cultures, the way in which leadership is actually a collective action and where people work together, then I think that's another way of reframing it and thinking it. And at the most sort of basic level, we can look at, professional learning communities or communities of practices in schools or in early childhood settings, for example, as examples of different ways of people organising collectively, where power is something that is shared rather than something that is simply invested in the formal sort of head of an organisation. I'm just going to finish, and I'm just going to ask one more question. Do you have any ideas? Sorry, there's so many quick things coming through. Do you have any ideas to engage and promote principals to transform themselves? I don't think the school staff are open to embrace changes if the leader is reluctant to transform themselves. I'm going to go to Vanessa, George, Fiona, just for a quick response from each of you.
Yeah, sure. So I think that's a really good question. Like what in the research that we're trying to do, we're working with the system and we're looking at all the different levels of leadership that can be enacted. And in other literature that I've written and published, I've spoken about the concept of the teacher leader. And I think let's just never forget that in the classroom, we're still leaders as teachers, and we can still enact a humane praxis of education even in that space, even if our principals are boards that are sitting on top of us. So never forget about the ability that you have and the power that you have to work with others and to help them to find themselves and to derive the best that they can from education. I'll shut up. Over to you both.
I'd just also like to chime in there. I think that this goes back to what Jane was saying about how we think about leadership as actually practices of leading, which I would say is open to anyone within an organization. So even though there are, people at the top might not be leading by example, there are always opportunities for anyone with and also collectives within educational institutions to make change and to lead in different ways. So I guess this is where we want to not privilege the formal leaders, so to speak, but not to disregard them, but to think about practices of leading and where they might emerge and where they can be supported, because in the complex world we're living in, it's not going to be the heroic leader at the top that's going to have all the answers anyway. So that would be my comment to that.
Thanks. I'll jump in. Yeah, or Jane, do you want me to stop? Yes. Okay. Now I was typing an answer to someone else. So I think we're answering John's question about how we encourage leaders to transform themselves. I hope that's right. But thank you. And I building on what the others said as well, I figured that was the case. But I think it is really important to both challenge the idea of leadership sitting within the principal, but also acknowledge that it is a construct that we have to deal with in our schools, in terms of, or deal with is the wrong word, but that we have in our schools, and that there are people who are sitting in those positions and they have important work and ways of thinking to do. But what I'd say in terms of them being able to transform and think differently and perhaps engage in some of these radical ideas is to give themselves the time and space to do it. What we're hearing in a lot of our research is that it's such a high pressure, busy role, and in other research, of course, as well, high pressure, busy role. It's challenging, but it's really important to take time to think, am I okay? Are other people okay? How can I do this differently? What are the forces that are making me, work in certain ways? And what are other opportunities that could be open to me if I was able to, to push some of these boundaries aside, perhaps? So I think that's my quick response.
Great. Thank you, Fiona. And I know some of us have been busily whacking in some answers because we've just about run out of time. I answered, what sort of supports was I talking about, and I talked about psychologists, special ed teachers, and unicorns. The person says these things are not always accessible. And my response is, indeed, this is where full funding of schools, and in particular public schools, is absolutely crucial. Please all write your MPs, because at the moment we have a federal government and our local state governments who are refusing to commit to full funding of public schools. Yes, I'm going to be political. But if we want to have wonderfully well-supported children and young people, then we need to fund our schools equitably. And we have an opportunity, I think, for governments to commit to that. So yes, I understand about unicorns, but let me say that I work in Scandinavia, where they have fully funded schools, and they do employ these staff. It is not unicorns. It's happening. It's reality. And we need to demand more of our politicians than what we currently are. And that is my happily political statement. Everyone go off, write your letters to MPs, and really kind of push this, because this is actually a live debate that federal and state education ministers are having right now as we speak. So we all need to raise our voices, not only as individuals, but through our principals associations, our teacher unions, early childhood, and through our higher education authorities. I'm now going to stop because I want to say thank you so much for everyone. I'm sorry that we didn't have an opportunity to answer all your questions and observations. Some great questions coming in there towards the end, but hopefully this has been enjoyable. It's given you a little taster, and I'm now going to hand over to George to wrap up.
Thank you, Jane, and thanks to the panel. And I guess for the audience today, in the last minute we have, these are kind of conversations and thinking that we do at the Master of Educational Leadership at Monash University. And so you can use the QR code there to find out more. For more information on postgraduate courses offered by Monash Education, you can also visit monash.edu education /future students /postgraduate, or use the QR codes, or book a call directly with the Faculty of Education. And so thank you everyone for joining us tonight. It's been a very interesting discussion and great questions from the panel. Again, as Jane said, sorry we couldn't get to all your questions, but now you know where to find us. So thank you everyone. for coming along. Good night.